Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Coming to the Center. We are Cherry Hill Seminary. We are all distance education. Our office is in the U.S. in South Carolina, but we have students all over. Today, we're lucky to have two brilliant scholars, one from England, right? And one from, well, Greece, basically, right? Okay. Robin Douglas and Sasha Chaitow. So, Dr. Robin Douglas is a historian and writer based in London, writing on the history of minority religious traditions and their relationship with the hegemonic majority. He is particularly interested in the history of revived paganism and the history of esoteric and occult movements. Dr. Sasha Chaitow is an independent scholar of Greek cultural history whose work focuses on ancient Byzantine and modern traditions. She's the author of Son of Prometheus, a new study of Horopollon's Hieroglyphica, and forthcoming studies of Byzantine demonology and of living Greek magic. And I think that you two are colleagues and friends, right? So we thought this would be a wonderful way to start a discussion, and we're looking forward. Oh, and my name is Holly E. Moore. I'm with Cherry Hill Seminary. So can you just start by sharing just a little bit about your focus and what drew you to these fields? Robin, would you start?
Yes, certainly. Yes. Well, for me, my interest in these subjects goes back to childhood, and that applies both to the Greek side of things and also to the, for want of a better word, esoteric side of things. I was one of these kids who was very interested in Greek mythology, as well as ancient history more generally, and the classics. Uh, and Yeah, as to the esoteric stuff as well, that's perhaps not quite the right word, but you know what I mean, weird stuff, if I can put it that way, paranormal, supernatural stuff. My interest in that sort of thing likewise goes back to an early age. I was one of these kids who used to read books about the supernatural, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, and so on. Yeah, I imagine that there's quite a few of us here tonight who, or this afternoon your time, who will have a similar background. And when I left school and I went to university, I ended up studying classics. It was going to be either law or classics, and it was easier to get into a classics course, so I did that. And unfortunately, I happened to like the subject as well, so that worked out quite well. And I did undergraduate and graduate studies in that subject. I didn't become a professional academic, but I did somehow manage to tread the path that got me to where I am today, doing reading and writing and research on the side, and having a presence online and publishing books and articles as an independent scholar. So I think that if the young me could see me today, he probably wouldn't be that surprised. And I think the people around me probably wouldn't be that surprised either. The people who knew me when I was a kid, they'd say, "Oh yeah, that figures."
I should have mentioned that it's just been, what, a couple of years since you finished working under Professor Ronald Hutton on your dissertation. Is that right?
Oh, he was yeah. It's a few years ago now. He and Owen Davis were the
Okay.
examiners of my PhD. And Yeah, I mean, Ronald Hutton, of course, is an absolute giant of pagan studies. Owen Davis, likewise, and it was a great privilege to be examined by those two living legends of the field.
And then you've also had me as a guest on your podcast, Religion Off the Beaten Track, right?
Indeed, yes. Thank you for that. Yes. You were speaking about constellated ministry, the book
Oh, yeah.
about pagan pastoral practice. Yeah, my podcast has somewhat fallen by the wayside because these things require a large investment of time, as you'll be aware. But it was fun to do while it lasted, and I was very grateful to have you on.
Thank you. Sasha, would you mind telling us a little bit about your background and where you've been headed?
Yeah, I've had a bit of an unorthodox journey. I started out as at art school, um, in an art school in Athens, where if you can imagine, I'd walk under the Parthenon every day. It's
Oh,
just kind of it's the scenery. So I think the first thing to land is kind of our bedtime stories. We learned to speak our language here by reading myths. These were our bedtime stories. That's how sort of um, ordinary it is for us. And I say us in the sense that, well, when you're raised that way, it takes a while to see it as something um, as special as perhaps folks who from other parts of the world encounter it as. And so, I mean, I'm half Greek, half British mix, let's say, by my dad. But I spent my childhood in Greece, and I initially went to art school alongside academic studies, two different schools at the same time. And it was the arts that really took me into esotericism because I was always wanting to give art meaning. I was aware there were various symbolic languages, quote unquote, out there, but obviously I didn't have a grounding in them. My initial studies were in literature and communication. So it was after basically I'd already finished university and was trying to make a sort of beginning of an art career that I discovered the master's degree in Western esotericism in at Exeter in the UK. And it was long distance. I was in Athens at the time, living in Athens at the time, and I just grabbed it with both hands. And so for me, what that course did really was gave a language and gave a vocabulary to many ideas that I seem to have been wading through for years, but with no real orientation or direction. And then the PhD followed off the back of that. I mainly focused on French symbolism and the French occult revival for my actual studies. The material I always really wanted to be studying was Greek thought and Greek tradition and Greek folk tradition. At the time, they didn't have the people to supervise me. That's the work I'm doing now. That's the work that I kind of turned towards in a little bit of a roundabout way, but all of it kind of, my art is in a bit of a hiatus at the moment, but really all of it feeding towards the art I wanted to make and the books I wanted to write. And I'm in the process of really trying to now bring that all together and develop it. But my focus really is quite strongly on both living Greek traditions, living Greek magic, bringing a better, I hope, eventually understanding of the Byzantine millennium, which not enough is understood about in the Anglophone worlds, and what we might call quote unquote Greek esotericism. I keep saying there's no such thing as Greek esotericism, but that's a conversation for me and Robin to have shortly, I think, to an Anglophone audience and to perhaps help dispel some of the myths and misunderstandings surrounding all that.
okay. Thank you. Yeah, Robin, how about addressing some of the things that Sasha just shared? The Western misconceptions about classical texts and myth. You want to take it away, and I'm going to take myself off the screen here.
Yes, well, this is the subject of the Insights course that we'll be conducting next month. So let me get a plug for that in if anyone's interested in coming along to that. It's 4 sessions throughout April, and we'll be focusing on a succession of different ancient Greek or ancient Greek language texts, one every week for each of the 4 weeks of the course. And the theme of the course will be essentially how modern people, and particularly modern practitioners of contemporary paganism, relate to these texts. Because um, sometimes contemporary pagans seem to relate to this sort of ancient material, if I may say so, in the same sort of way as fundamentalist Christians relate to the Bible. Um, that is to say that they will take it up and they will treat it as if the material is transparent, self-explanatory, and as if a modern person from a Western country with our socialization and upbringing can immediately understand what the text is and isn't saying. And that sort of fundamentalist approach to texts clearly doesn't work with the Bible. It can lead you in some very undesirable directions with that text. But equally, it can lead to misunderstandings, sometimes even reinforce prejudices when we take that approach to ancient Greek material. And that the purpose of the course will be to consider the issues involved in us as modern people, particularly from Western countries, approaching these texts and deciding how far they can speak to us as texts which have got a kind of basic eternal human meaning on the one hand, but yet also as texts which come from a particular time and culture on the other, which may create barriers to our understanding of them and may require some work for us to really understand how we ought to be approaching them and making use of them.
Yes. Sasha, your thoughts on this dilemma?
I think Robin has put together something that I am incredibly, incredibly grateful to see, because these are very real problems. One of the reasons that I had wanted to pursue this topic area at all was because very early in my studies of esotericism, I realized that there were very large gaps in the bibliography, in the literature, and that the understanding of the Greek material was heavily, heavily mediated, firstly by Renaissance, secondly by Protestant, thirdly by modern scholarship. And this led to, and this is pretty much what I've untangled in my book on Horapollon as well, that the layers of what we call reception, the layers of our own assumptions, the way we're acculturated, and I can say this as somebody who's half Greek but half diaspora with British education. The lenses, the filters through which the material reaches us. And if faith is layered over the top of all of that, and a particular sort of inner drive to discover something older, something deeper, something perhaps purer, it's very easy to forget that it is the product of a particular time and place and a particular people. And when you then have a trajectory where that people is still around, and those people are still around, and of course they're not the same people, they've gone through 2,000, 3,000 years of history, that doesn't give them less of a say, really. But on the other hand, it's also true and it's also valid that traditions can evolve and can transform and can be taken up in very far away places by a different set of people. But I think it's important to kind of respect the journey that that material has gone on. And I think that there is room for dialogue and for understanding. Let's understand the people who produced these texts and what they were talking about in the first place. And secondly, is there or is there not a degree of respect due to the people's for whom this is still part of their living heritage? So I think there's two areas there that I think Robin is creating or has created in this course, the room to discuss in a very sensitive and in-depth way.
Mm-hmm. When I visited Egypt, probably it will be my one and only time, about 3 years ago, our guide was talking with me one day, and I said, "Mamdu, do you know anything about your genealogy, your origin, your family origins, and he just kind of looked at me. He said, Holly, we are the Egyptians. This is where we are, and I'm related to everybody in this city. This was in Luxor. So, yeah, it was very interesting to be in a strictly Muslim country, which also greatly valued their heritage. That didn't come about except over several centuries of colonialism, but they are very adamant about that now. So I thought about that when I was listening to your video earlier. How do you both engage with these classics in a way that you find is more transparent? Tell us beyond the belief thing, because I think a lot of our pagan contemporary practitioners have left behind, they've rejected any kind of truth claims. So tell me about the transparency of myth as you see it, whether people believe it or not.
Robin?
Either of you, yes.
Well, yes, I mean, I'd make the point that as far as myth is concerned, there's a long tradition going back to antiquity of engaging with myth in different ways and on different levels. And yes, we know from the surviving evidence that there were different traditions of mythological interpretation in the ancient world, ranging from the literal to different forms of metaphorical interpretation. Um, Much as we're familiar with, I suppose, in other religions such as Christianity, where there is a spectrum of responses to the scriptural texts, ranging from the literal to the symbolic, figurative, metaphorical, etc.
Yes.
And I would say that I mean, it's not so much that each individual has to find their approach to this material. I think in many ways the material finds its own approach to the individual. It's not so much that I decide how to interact with these texts. They, in a sense, decide how to interact with me. And the individual isn't necessarily the agent or the only agent in that process. And the meaning and significance that the contemporary pagan practitioners find in this ancient material is ultimately a matter for them. And all I can do is to provide and to encourage some discussion about the historical background of the material. And hopefully that will lead people to a greater appreciation of what they're engaging with and will help them to avoid certain misunderstandings. But on the spiritual level, I think that's a matter for them and the text. They can, I mean, I can only, as it were, arrange the date and book the table at the restaurant and so on. What they get up to at the restaurant and when they go home in the taxi after it is up to them.
Okay. Thank you. Sasha, I know this is a particular interest, shall we say, of yours.
What's important to me is to be fair to the material. So first of all, I would say, for example, Hesiod's Theogony is produced at a time when the Greek, the Mycenaean, really, the tribes are gradually beginning to form the early city states. And the text itself, I mean, I'm giving too much away here, aren't I? But it should be part of the course. But it essentially represents an attempt to braid together diverse myths from tribes that are essentially related, but are in the process of becoming a people. They are literally in the. It is a text that represents a step across a threshold from one type of social organization into another type of social organization, and to do so, it's essentially looking for ways to make sure everybody is represented and everybody ends up with kinship bonds of one sort and another, because kinship bonds basically are everything to the Greek mindset. Say it was like that then, it's like that now, but that's another conversation. So to It is also the oldest written material that we have. Well, there's Homer, but it does a different job. And it is also attributed to the muses themselves as this kind of ultimate authority. And the muses themselves over the centuries are very much, they very much lose their standing over the centuries, less so among the Greeks, certainly from the Romans onwards. And that's a whole other conversation again. So for me, realizing what a text, and I'm just running with a theogony because it's a particular darling of mine, but realizing what it represents and what it's trying to do immediately moves us away from the is this real, is this not real? And if we then look at how it's analyzed and how it's, as Robin said, interpreted at different stages over the centuries, and that we find, especially in the classical era or among the Stoics, we find different readings, different applications of allegory. Classical learning survived throughout the Byzantine Empire and was upheld as a very valuable part of the legacy. So let me just say that now. It's it is very much part of that particular tradition. But again, it is interpreted differently. It is read differently. So for me, I think it's important to understand that each reading represents its time. Our reading represents our time, and that does not make it invalid at all. But we do have to accept that it represents us and the way we've been shaped and the lenses and filters we bring to it, I think. And
Yes.
that makes for a far more honest, I think, connection and contact with the material.
I, from time to time, teach a little bit on a non-graduate level about ancient Egyptian religion, and one of the first things I say is we are not ancient Egyptians, and they didn't explain to us. They left a lot of written records, but we don't. They were different people. This was 5,000 years ago. We don't know what they were thinking. So I really appreciate both of you having that kind of approach.
On the theogony, there's also the issue of the performance context. This is something that particularly interests me because the way that we read this particular text today is quite literally by reading it. We encounter it with a book in our hands, or we encounter it on a laptop screen or a phone screen. The original audience of the Theogony would have encountered it. We might surmise at a public festival or something like that. Certainly in a context which it would have been performed orally, you would have had a bard type figure, an Aoidos, who would have been singing the text. It wouldn't have been a written text. It would have been sung to the accompaniment of a stringed instrument. And you have to put yourself as best you can in the shoes of someone, if shoes is really the metaphor, in the position of someone who would have been hearing this performed for the first time. They would have heard this great deluge of mythology bursting forth from this performer. Um, uh, and it may even have been an enchanting, spellbinding experience. You would have sat there, and this material would have come out of the mouth of this performer as if indeed it was inspired by the muses, as if it was a supernatural episode of revelation, not a revelation in the Abrahamic sense, but nevertheless something coming from the divine realm. And I think it's difficult to capture that kind of experience when we encounter this text today. And indeed, there are even parts of it where for example, lists of names. We might find it rather heavy going, maybe even a bit tedious, name after name after name after name. If you'd been there at the original performance, listening to this material spilling out of the mouth of the Aoidos, it would have hit you quite differently. And it would have been I imagine a very impressive experience to have had, and something which might have given you a real sense of being in touch with something divine.
That's fascinating that you're moving into the realm of embodied meaning and the arts. What did you call it when there was a voice coming out of a deity figure? Um, there's a name for that. Anyway, making it appear that the gods are talking to the people, but the whole sensory experience. Can y'all address that a little bit?
July or maybe Sasha.
Sasha, you had talked about
Sorry?
not Theodosia, Zoe. Zoe and her
Right. Well,
her
yes,
fragrances.
yes, Zoe and her talking icon, um, as well as her fragrances. Um, so as I've because I've taught a course on Greek sacred art, and one of the first things I always say is that art was always functional and it was always effectively either a protective device and I'm talking about the ancient world, and I'm talking right through, I would say, the Byzantine era as well. Art took the form either of something protective or as what I like to call a divine communication device. And this is as true for the statues and the practice of statue animation. Maybe you meant telestiki. I think you may have meant when the practice of statue animation.
Yes.
Or and the same or very similar, let's say, very similar practices with altered perhaps interpretations, but holding the same role within the society of the time, is eventually also transferred to icons, where the statue or later icon and ancient statues that were kept, in fact, in Byzantium, were used as oracles for centuries within the Christian era, anyway. And sometimes destroyed, not because so much of Christian fervor, let's say, but because they were saying a little bit too much in some cases. So they were very much seen as still animated and still holding a sort of ensoulment of some or other being, even if they didn't call them deities by then. And when it comes to the whole sensory experience of um, ritual and of well, I think it's important to note that the theogony is not a ritual text as such. Actually, it's well, it would certainly have been performed, but it would have been performed at what were known as these pan-Hellenic gatherings, and these gatherings for poetry competitions and so on. So it's not actually, even though it does tell the story of the birth of the gods, it's not a cultic text in itself, the way perhaps the Orphic hymns might be, or the way the Homeric hymns might be, that or liturgical text might be. So it holds a slightly different significance. But in terms of the sensory experience, whether poetic or religious, and that's an interesting distinction anyway, yes, there has always been an emphasis on the voice, very much so. There has, and the magical uses of voice and the magical and the liturgical uses of voice. And there has also always been an emphasis on um, engaging all of the senses within a ritual context. And that was as true in antiquity, I believe, as it is today. Um, and each of those were not simply there for decoration. This wasn't simply for effect. It really was a process of trying to envelop perhaps the of moving into a different realm, to really have the sense of change, of an altered state, if you like,
Mm-hmm.
um, within the ritual or cultic experience. And that would be different from period to period. So I don't think we shouldn't really put them all in the same basket.
Okay, all right, thanks. Um, Robin, you just recently published your book, Paganism Persisting. So I know that our focus today is mainly on ancient texts and contexts, but I wonder if you'd like to say anything about the evidence of paganism, survivals, revivals, all of that.
Ah, yes, yes. Yes, I co-wrote that book. I
Excuse me,
have to share
yes.
credit for it with Francis Young, who's a very distinguished historian, more so than myself. What we seek to do in that book is to break away from two models which have been popular in the past. The first model is, and it's particularly associated with the creation story of Wicca, is that the coming of Christianity did not, in fact, result in paganism being killed off. Paganism survived perhaps as an underground tradition. Perhaps there's more than that. Perhaps the peasants in the countryside were still pagans, and there was just a very thin veneer of Christianity on the top of society. Um, but in any event, paganism survived, and indeed, in the Wiccan version of this narrative, it survived through into 1950s England, when Gerald Gardner publicised this witch cult that he claimed to have discovered a few years before. There's that model of survival, lineal continuous survival, which was quite popular, more than quite popular, in the 19th and 20th centuries. It was very fashionable to see paganism as being something that had persisted in quite a strong way into the Christian era and maybe even to the present day. That narrative has been essentially discredited, at least since the 1970s. And an alternative narrative is now more popular, which essentially says that contemporary paganism is a modern concoction. It is a modern product of the modern age, devised by modern people for other modern people. It's like Scientology, essentially. It's a fundamentally contemporary product, which only has a rhetorical or a superficial link to historical pre-Christian paganism. And what we're seeking to do is to break away from those two models, and to say that what has happened, um, certainly in Western European culture, is that no, paganism didn't survive in any meaningful sense. Um, it was incorporated into and transmuted Catholic Christianity, which is a different issue, but it didn't survive as an alternative, self-conscious religious tradition. Um, so the first of the models I referred to is not true, but also contemporary paganism can't be written off as being this shallowly rooted, essentially modern construct with no more than a rhetorical link to ancient pagan materials. What actually happened was that classical culture and classical learning, art, literature, and philosophy came to have a place, generally quite a prestigious place, in Western European Christian culture. So if people were dissatisfied with the with the prevailing religious options of the day, um, and for most of the Christian era, that would have been some form of Catholic or Protestant Christianity. And then after the Enlightenment hit, it would have included secularism, Enlightenment skepticism as well. If people were discontented with those options, there was this inheritance from pagan classical antiquity right there. It was right there. The texts were there, the literature was there, the forms of art and architecture and so forth were there, and people could reach for those and reanimate them and revive them in different ways. And that indeed is what people did time and time again, repeatedly, right up to the present day. And what these revivals consisted of were neither, they can't be reduced to either of the two models which I referred to. They were genuine novelties insofar as they didn't flow from a genuine lineal survival of pagan religion. But also, they can't be written off as being purely contemporary products because they did draw on authentic, genuine ancient texts and ideas and symbols and forms of spirituality. And what you get in pagan revivals is an amalgam of the old and the new. You get genuinely old source material together with modern concerns. And you find this throughout history up until the present day and the modern pagan revival. Um, and one of my interests is the way in which the ancient and the modern components of these things sit together. And that brings us back to the Insights course, which we're going to be conducting next month, because that's going to be an exercise in inviting people to reflect on how to navigate that mixture of ancient and modern, and how our modern concerns and lenses can properly fit with the ancient material that we're engaging with.
You know, it occurs to me that both of you have been discussing how culture is so complex and many layered, and I think in the West and in modern centuries we think of time as a linear construct, and ancient peoples didn't necessarily view things that way at all. And this idea of recurring or cyclical or other ways of looking at time makes it difficult for us to appreciate their work. I also think that in the US, in our time, it's very difficult for Americans to comprehend a society where you just are born there and therefore that's your religion. Although we might have a predominant religion here, we've always at least said that we had freedom of religion, and indeed we have thousands of religions here. And so the idea that, people came along and then the Romans hit, and then Constantine said, okay, we're all going to be Christian. So everybody flipped a switch and became Christian. Yeah, I think we know intellectually that's not true, but it's hard to conceptualize that wherever you lived, that was the way you lived. And however you were born, your parents, your family, your tribe, that was your primary influence, and wasn't necessarily a chosen devotion. Is that fair?
If I may, I mean, especially thinking of the Mediterranean and the migration and interaction of people. If we were to go back, let's say before the Hellenistic period, if we were to go back as far back as before Alexander, let's say before or up until Alexander, you'd have to, I think we'd be looking at something that resembles India a little bit more closely, localized cults, but also shared deities and different locations. I mean, even when Robin was talking before and emphasizing about Hesiod, how these epic poems would have been performed. And I was thinking, and in different locations, they actually changed some of the wording so as not to offend the locals. So if they were going to talk about a particular tribe descending from a particular god or a river god or something, they might change the name of that river to match the people of that area. So if it was being performed in northern Greece, it would be slightly worded differently than if it was performed somewhere else. And we have records of this. So if we're talking ancient Greece, you've got localized cults, and you respect the cult of the city that you're in. And what takes priority is respect. What takes priority is the relationship and the kinship between cities as much as between individuals. Once we move into the Hellenistic era, and once we've got the Romans in the mix as well, who didn't exactly wipe us out, they merged with us. We are Greco-Roman, we are not Greek. We are Greco-Roman mixed with other Mediterranean peoples. It doesn't even matter what the roots are. What matters is that the language that packaged this and the ideas that sort of still traveled through remained in whatever form that they remained. And as you're getting these forms of exchange, you can be Egyptian and meet a Greek somewhere in Anatolia of the day, what is now Turkey, and say, oh, so you've got a god who communicates and you've got another god who deals with the dead. Okay, well, we call him such and such. What do you call him? And this is where we begin getting syncretization. Sometimes syncretism was used as a power tool, as a hegemonic tool, sometimes between ordinary people and traders. It was a way to get to know it, to find common ground.
Mm.
And so, being born in a place and having a particular religion, you know what, if I need a spell for the evil eye and you've got one, I'm going to use yours and I'm going to use mine. I'm not going to worry about who your grandmother was. You've got a spell for the evil eye. Okay, I'm going to try mine and yours. Why not? Do it better than one. That is more the attitude, really, that we find especially from looking at some of the material culture, at some of the archaeology, at some, and once we actually have written records as well. I don't think it's as cut and dried as, you're born in one place and that's your faith. And it's not even faith, it's practice.
Mm-hmm.
Faith is more the idea of it being something that you believe in your inner soul is far more a Protestant concept than it ever was a Greek concept. Or even a Greek Christian concept, frankly. Mm-hmm. And if I may just say about Constantine, and then I'll pop back in my books, all he did was legalize Christianity. He didn't actually enforce it, and there are still serious debates really as to whether he did it in good faith or just to keep the peace, because it looked like monotheism was a one-way track anyway, and it was more for political reasons.
Well, you're surely not saying that he did not have a dream before the battle the next day.
I'm saying dreams are cheap.
I'm being satirical.
Yeah.
I think one thing, Holly, that you said that is absolutely right is this there is a real disjunction here which has been created by post-Enlightenment concepts of freedom of religion. And one of the things that the Enlightenment did was it disjoined religion from the rest of life and from the rest of people's identities.
Well put.
So yeah, I mean, nowadays you can be British, French, American, etc., and you can retain the whole of your identity while switching your theological opinion or indeed your form of practice, the place of worship that you go to, and so on. You can make that choice and make that switch, and it doesn't affect who you are fundamentally. But even in modern Western countries, there are still some surviving elements of the older idea that religion is something that is embedded in the rest of life and embedded in someone's other identities. The Irish comedian Dara Ó Briain, for example, said, "I'm an atheist, but I'm a Catholic atheist." Another example of that would be again from Ireland, a very different person from Dara Ó Briain, one of the terrorist leaders on the loyalist side during the Troubles, said, "I'm not a good Christian, but I'm a very good Protestant." When you hear these quotes, you know what they mean. You immediately know what they mean by them. And I think even in Christianity, even in post-Enlightenment Christianity, where you have the most influence of this idea that religion is just a theological opinion which is separable from anything else and can be changed at will. Even in that kind of milieu, you quite often have the idea that your religion is an ethnic identity. Christianity quite often functions, even in the modern West, as an ethnic identity, where participating in the tribe's rituals can be as important as the content of your faith in Jesus Christ and what you believe about certain theological propositions. So those ideas have become weakened, very greatly weakened in Western countries, but they're still there to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
They have become weakened here so much, I would say, because it's worth remembering that Greek Orthodox Christianity, as it's practiced in the Greek sphere, because I know in America there are other expressions of it, which in a different cultural community, in a different community, will take different expressions. But here, for one, it is more important to participate and to be seen participating. What you believe is your business.
Yeah.
It is not about, it is not what you believe, and it's almost something you are not asked. It's a faux pas, in fact, to ask. But it is about the acts, it's about being seen making the acts. And the acts are to do with community, they are to do with protection, they are to do with renewal, rebirth, they are to do with catharsis sometimes, they're to do with very, very human, shockingly reminiscent of older practices. And with when you've got people wandering through fields with an icon and bedecking it with flowers and sitting it in a tree because um, as part of a pilgrimage to ask for rain, and you've got a priest following on. Um, one has to ask what kind of Christianity. This isn't about one's confession of faith. That's within, but it is very much about people and about community and about society, and even the most atheist Orthodox, just to borrow Robin's example there, will probably light a candle at Easter because really it's just the coming of the new life and the rebirth of spring. It's a very different perception of religion than the sola scriptura, sola fide Protestant expression, again, which has also shaped Western thought and Western education, but it hasn't touched us here at all
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
until perhaps the last century.
Yeah. So, what would each of you say to modern, contemporary, I should say, pagans about why, or really anybody, why the ancient texts are important? Why should we read the classics? And if you had to pick one or two for the non professional, what would you recommend?
Oh, well, I mean, I could give a contrarian answer to that and say that the materials that people engage with are up to them. It's a matter of personal choice. I'm completely modern or postmodern in that I believe in individualized choice and personal responses to these kinds of materials. So to that extent, I'm not selling ancient texts to people and saying that you should engage with these things. But I do think there is a great benefit to be had from them, and that benefit lies both in the fact that they do have, I believe, perennially valid messages. They do speak to human beings across times and cultures. And also they're valuable precisely because they are different and indeed alien in some ways, and precisely because they do force us to do some work in understanding where they're coming from and in surmounting the cultural barriers. I think that there's a useful discipline there, there's a useful exercise for people in coming to grips with this material. Um, as to particular texts, the I'm going to come back to the Insights course again. That is going to be focusing on four particular texts, as I mentioned. The first is Hesiod's Theogony, which we mentioned earlier. The second is the Homeric hymn to Demeter. The third is the Orphic hymns. And the fourth is a text known as the Mithras liturgy. That's a modern title. It's an excuse me, ancient Greek language text, which was unearthed from a papyrus in Egypt. And I think these four texts, in quite different ways, give something of an introduction to the ancient Eastern Mediterranean religious experience. That they're quite different. They come from different times and places, but they shed light on different aspects of ancient religiosity. Um, and yeah, I'm having made that plug. I will stop plugging the course.
Okay, no, you don't have to do that. It's our course, so. Sasha, do you have thoughts on that?
Uh, well, I think Robin's covered most of it. Again, why engage with ancient texts? I don't think I can do much better than Robin did. If from especially from a contemporary pagan perspective, if if somebody is going to engage with the Greek, specifically with the Hellenic pantheon and Hellenic material, then of course it's fundamental, but it's also fundamental to realize that nothing was set in stone in that period either. So one would want to read Hesiod, but one I think would also want to be reading Plato, the Stoics, understand the disagreements between the schools of philosophy. There was never one monolithic theology that we can say is fundamentally Hellenic, and this is it, and this was always it. We can try and interpret it that way today, but then it is very at a far remove from anything Hellenic, and we probably shouldn't be calling it that. That said, so I would really suggest there uh, certainly start with Hesiod, but also then read the interpretations, look at the attempts to allegorize, look at what Plato says, look at what some of the Stoics say, look at the syncretization and how religion and even the names of gods themselves serve a social need of some sort. I think that in itself is a valuable lesson in understanding how, for the Greeks at least, the gods were malleable over time. They could literally tear down gods and raise them again. There are some attestations of that, particularly during the turmoil after the death of Alexander in Athens. They literally ripped down some of the statues because they had of the gods because they hadn't protected the city, and raised statues to some of Alexander's generals, to one of Alexander's generals, instead, and called him the new god, Demetrius, someone, because he had saved the city. And then he fell out of favor, so they ripped him down again and reinstated Aphrodite or whoever it was. Yeah.
Will
So,
you tell Will you tell us about Hercules and the lake?
which bit? What
Um,
about? Oh, the
oh, and the Hydra. Was it the Hydra?
yeah.
Each time he cut something off, it came back.
So one of the most one of Hercules' labors is and he is undergoing these labors to atone for um, killing his wife in a fit of madness, or his children, and so on. And it it is very much part of the Greek thought that one needs to balance out. You've done a harm, you need to, in some way, make restitution for it. And one of the labors is the Lernaean Hydra, which is described as this monster with many heads, like a dragon with many heads. And each time you cut one off, two grow back in its place, and it's never ending. Whereas this, and eventually, Heracles comes up with the idea of setting fire to the necks the minute the head has been cut off, and that cauterizes the neck, and then it doesn't grow heads again. Now, this and many of the other labors has through modern scholarship been understood as an allegory. I mean, it's still questionable, but a lot of the evidence is very, very plausible, very, very compelling. Has been understood as an allegory for dealing with a swamp and a particular river, which was constantly, this swamp was constantly flooding, and because it was stagnant water, effectively, it attracted a lot of mosquitoes, and the mosquitoes caused malaria, which was a plague on the region. And what in the labor later, or in the solution later attributed to Heracles, whoever actually resolved this, um, blocked the necks of this river by setting fire to, because it was also producing a lot of methane, set fire to the methane, killed the mosquitoes, and created some kind of opening so that the stagnant waters could clear. And so the hydra has been interpreted as, in fact, a swamp with stagnant waters and multiple tributaries that were continuing to flood the area and cause the problem. Now, paleogeologists have looked at this, scholars of various specializations have looked at this, and in fact tracked some of the other Herculean labors to explanations such as these. Some are more plausible than others. Some we do have slightly harder evidence for. Some may totally be the realm of myth. I don't know. But that is one of the readings.
Well, I'm always fascinated by the meaning making, and that seemed like a great example. So I don't know if everybody saw a while ago that I put in the chat. If you have questions, put them in there. But I wonder if anybody does, and maybe you just have been listening. Is there something you would like to ask Robin and Sasha? Cynthia? Whoops. I think that was my fault, Cynthia. There you go. Oh, we still can't hear you. You're unmuted, but I'm not hearing you. Maybe you can type your question in the chat. No. Okay, Valerie asks, I'm wondering if modern Reconstructionism has relied too heavily on text and not enough on religious something.
It stopped me from typing. Can I just finish my question, Holly?
Yeah.
Well, you have alluded to it. Both of you have alluded to it with speaking about the culture, the significance of knowing the culture and the historical time period. But I'm just wondering if your takeaway, and with respect, because I know both of you are textualists, as I've approached it, it seems like trying to figure out religious practice by reading the text is kind of a vain endeavor, and you really need to look at religious studies and understand, like, I'm more interested in what were the practices around apotropaic magic than what was the spell they were using, like than repeating an exact spell. I'm more interested in like how it related to life and the whole. And I'm wondering what you have to say about that with respect to pagan reconstructionism or in paganism generally with regard to texts. Have you alluded to it? You said that we have this kind of literalist interpretation of the text, but what are contemporary people to do with that outside of becoming religious studies scholars or anthropologists?
Thank you.
Robin, can I take this one?
Sure, yeah.
If I may, because I mean, thank you for that question. Actually, if I can just say, I argue with philologists all the time, because quite the opposite. I'm looking at living practices and practices that have clear roots, at least through late antiquity. Yes, through to this day. And I'm not talking pristine survivals. I am talking nonetheless practices that have been handed down family to family, midwife to trainee midwife, and so on and so forth. And precisely as you say, it's less about the precise wording, it's about what it means within the actual context of a community, within the actual context of the relationship to the seasons, to the land, to the spirits of place. All of this is still alive for us. So short of saying, come visit, what can people do in terms of Reconstructionism? This is perhaps one of my greatest difficulties, perhaps, I would say, that I quite agree that we shouldn't be reconstructing from texts. when we have living traditions that are not what they would have been 2,000 years ago, but they're not reconstructed. They're not reconstructed either, and they're not revivals. They are simply alive, and they are still alive. They have come down to us from our forebears as they have, yes, affected by whatever changes have happened in this land of ours, but living. And so it makes more sense to me as a modern person to say, well, surely it is worth tapping into that living current respectfully, if one is not from here, obviously, but there are ways, than simply trying to take it and reconstruct it and reinvent a wheel, which is already spinning, so to speak. That's kind of where I come at it from, and I'm sure Robin will have his own take.
Well, I think that yes, there's limited value in an enterprise of reconstructing an ancient religion from texts, even if that could be done. I think there's nothing wrong with engaging with texts, drawing on them for inspiration and so forth. It seems to me that there's limited value in a strong reconstructionist enterprise, if I can put it that way. And that can become a kind of an exercise in antiquarianism. My own focus is on texts simply because I happen to like reading texts, and that's the way that my mind works, and that's simply the way that my own studies and research have gone. The fact that I tend to emphasize texts and work on texts does not mean that I advocate texts as being the only or even the most important source for religious practice, pagan or otherwise. Um, to that extent, my focus on texts is just a personal quirk. Some people will share that, others will not.
Well, and Cynthia typed her question, but I just have to ask while we're on the subject of text, did you learn Greek first, or did you read translations and then decide to study the Greek? Because I found that once I began to learn to read hieroglyphs, it's just a whole different experience. I mean, it's very difficult to explain to somebody what it's like to read a language like that. And I'm thinking that Greek must be similar, that you're reading something very different maybe from any translation you've ever seen. Can you speak to that?
Yes, yeah. I mean, the problem of translation. This is a perennial one, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I think Isaiah Berlin said, "Poetry is what gets lost in translation." Um, and yes, I mean, I started learning Latin and Greek. Latin at the age of 11, Greek at the age of 13. So it was relatively late on that I was taught the original languages, and before that I had to engage with the material in English. Um, and that's not to say that one can't get quite a long way by reading things in English. I don't want to set this up as a gate and to gatekeep people out of reading these texts if they don't have the original languages. But yeah, there is no substitute for knowing the original languages and being able to read them, being able to read the text in the original. You can get a lot of benefit out of them. You can get a lot out of them by reading English. There's no question about that. But it's not the same. It's not a complete substitute.
Sasha, which did you do first? Although you grew up with the Greek, modern
I'm
Greek.
grown up bilingual, so I can't really answer that. I I do translations myself. I struggle greatly with some translations I read. What I would say to people, because I'll follow Robin in saying, obviously, this is not a reason to gatekeep. You're not going to learn a whole language. Not everybody's going to learn a whole language. What I will recommend is check very carefully which translations you pick. The newer, the better, really. And if you can find ones done by Greeks, by actual Greeks, prefer them, because they will generally be scholars who are very highly qualified to get the accuracy right, but they also have an ear for the language that you really truly cannot be replaced. And the other thing is, there's often this misconception that ancient Greek and modern Greek are, well, totally different languages. They are different versions of the same language. But for somebody even contemplating coming into contact, unless you just want to read all the ancient texts, if you want to read just the ancient texts, fair enough. But from a philological standpoint, but if you want to actually immerse yourself more in the breadth of the material, then modern Greek and what is known as Koine Greek, the common Greek of the era of Alexander, that's biblical Greek. We still speak it today. We speak a more vernacular version, but we have different registers. So the most formal register is pretty much the same as that. So it's a little bit like Shakespearean English, Chaucer's English, and modern English. I mean, those are the distinctions. So I would say pick good modern translations. Avoid anything Victorian like the plague, frankly.
Ditto for Budge. Wallace Budge, yeah.
And from there on in, consider learning and engaging with it, perhaps.
Okay.
As a second step, perhaps.
Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes. Cynthia says, we can fall in love with our studies. Was there a point when something caused you to perhaps change your orientation to the work or your studies that led you to another avenue in the field?
Well, I can go first. I mean, for me, there was no road to Damascus moment. That's quite a Christian thing indeed. But I can trace back a straight line to my childhood in terms of my interest in these matters. And for me, it's been this consistent thing that I've had through my life. Um, and so that there hasn't been a point of a point of change, a point of conversion, a point of falling in love. It's an interesting question though. It's an interesting question. I hadn't actually considered that before. Um, I don't know. Maybe it would have been more exciting and romantic if I had had a moment like that. But I don't think I can claim I have had that.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to say anything about that, Sasha? Because I see we've got a couple more questions. So if you don't, it's all right.
I have too much to say, which isn't that interesting, but I've had several fork turns down the line, most of which were externally driven. Supervisors pushing me in a direction I wasn't really interested in going in, but I went because I couldn't help it. The fact that I even studied esotericism at all is a wonderful, and I think this is the one to leave you with, synchronicity. I had every intention of just, head down, and I already had a master's degree and I was already working. And through my door drops the Watkins review for that particular. I think it came out twice a year or something, and in this little sort of Watkins is an esoteric bookshop in London for those who don't know it, and
Okay.
it's and they still produce a little journal with the latest releases and book reviews and what have you. And I see this tiny advertisement for the Masters in Western Esotericism at it, which was in its first year. So I think, and that was it was like, you've been chosen. It was that sensation. It's like, I have to do this. So I think that perhaps.
Yeah. A comment from Margaret. Learning Hebrew led to much the same effect as you're describing with Latin, Greek, and hieroglyphs. Yes. And then Jenny is asking for a friend. Thank you for sharing your wisdom today. If someone in America is drawn, even passionate about connecting with the living tradition, how does one do that in studies and practice? Robin, you wrote about persistence of paganism. Do you want to tackle this?
I think as far as living traditions are concerned, I think Sasha is the person for that.
Okay, all right.
Get to know some Greeks. Don't ask too much too fast. Start asking about what their grandmothers did, how they kept the animals safe, how ask about the evil eye. It's overcooked. It's talked about the wrong way. It's been turned into this pop culture nonsense. But in fact, it's at the root of a lot of the apotropaic household magic that is still very much present. It is a long, slow process of getting to know the culture from within. I can't make it easy. I can't say to you, read this book and read that book, and you'll get there. You can very much get there. And there are people, in fact, I will be teaching an ancestral ancestral something or other course for hosted by diaspora Greeks, for connecting with this very material. And it doesn't have to be just for Greeks, obviously. It doesn't need to be just for Greeks, but it's about understanding what to us is simply part of tradition. It's simply part of what's being passed down to us. So it's the way you would get to know, you would respectfully want to get to know any culture that you are trying to discover more closely. It's pretty much the same in a very human way, and especially through women. This is mostly carried by women. A lot of men know a lot of the traditions as well, but the hard stuff is for the ladies. So find your local Greeks, and we never call this stuff magic. We call it tradition. So
Thank you.
that's the only shortcut I can really talk about.
It sounds like good advice to me. Thank you both. This has been wonderful. I'm so grateful for your sharing this with our Cherry Hill Seminary audience. And as Robin reminded us a number of times, there is a course that Sasha and Robin, Dr. Chaitow and Dr. Douglas, will be teaching in April with Cherry Hill, so you can go over to our website, or it's posted other places like Facebook. And we appreciate your attending. That ends our program.
Thank you very much thank you for having us.
Thank you
Very much.